Well, hello there. This is a Roma. I'm recording it with video. So if you're listening to this and you would rather watch it, you can go to my YouTube channel, which is pretty recent. This guy named Mike Maher, M-A-H-E-R. I should probably ask him how to pronounce his name. Anyway, he offered to put this together, and he's uploading episodes that go up now and also episodes from the archives. Bit by bit, they're all getting up there on the YouTube channel. Of course, we have to make some edits and some adjustments, so it's a gradual process, but I really appreciate him doing this. And, it's one of these things. It's hopefully a win-win. We've got a revenue share going on, so he's working with content I've already produced, and maybe we'll make some money from it. We'll see what happens. Anyway, it's if you're on YouTube, just search Chris Ryan. That's the channel. Okay, so I just wanted to talk about a couple of things that have sort of been percolating in my mind recently. First thing I wanted to do was to expand on what I started talking about in the Robert Wright episode, 469, the last episode that went up, where I was talking about, some of the things in life that I don't necessarily talk about on the podcast, but that are not ideal. And this whole idea that we have very partial understandings of anyone's life if it's coming at us through any kind of media filter, even if it's just social media, like an Instagram feed that just accentuates all the good things. Anyway, I was talking about relationships and how disappointing it is when what you think is one kind of relationship turns out to be another kind of relationship. When you think someone is a true friend, and then something comes up, whether it's something very simple like, you move to different places, and so staying in touch requires a little bit of effort, and it turns out that, your friend is not willing or able to put in that effort. That feels like a rejection, a sadness. Or when it turns out that the basis of your friendship had more to do with something that, some perceived value perhaps, or some angle that the person had that you weren't aware of. And come on, people deal with this all the time. So I don't mean to say this is any kind of situation that's unique to me or anything. I really just wanted to talk about how the confusion over what a relationship actually is leads to a lot of unnecessary suffering. One area where this comes up a lot is in sexual relationships, where I think because we live in a culture that encourages us to believe that sex and sexual desire and attraction are really the same thing as love, which is total nonsense, but we're really encouraged to believe that. It can be really hard to disentangle those two things and to recognize that sometimes you have a relationship with someone that is erotic and sexually charged and not love, and that love, that kind of romantic love, will never actually be a part of it. And of course, another aspect of this problem is that we think of love as being one thing, and we don't really think about all the different forms of love, different manifestations of love. So, I think about women that I've had sex with that I loved as people. And honestly, it would be hard for me to have an ongoing sexual relationship with someone that I didn't love as a person. But that doesn't mean that relationship was necessarily going to ever evolve into a partnership kind of relationship. Sharing our lives, living together, meet my mom kind of thing. And I started to get very clear about that in my 30s, and that really was very helpful for me. And I think a lot of the problems that people run into involve not distinguishing the different kinds of love that they feel, and then not communicating that clearly to people. I think mostly we don't communicate it clearly because we just don't understand it. It's really hard in this social setting to think through these things, to think through the fact that, I really enjoy being with you. We have great sex together. We have good, the pleasure is awesome. We connect on that plane. But we're never going to live together, either because, you're married, I'm married, one of us has a pre-existing relationship that precludes that, or, for me, it would be really hard to be with someone if I didn't like her taste in music, for example. Like if she listens to shitty music, that's kind of a deal breaker. It's a deal breaker in a relationship sense. It's not a deal breaker in a sexual friendship sense. And when I say shitty taste in music, I mean other things, right? Like, just incompatibility. Someone doesn't like to travel. I really like to travel. Someone doesn't like spicy food. I really like spicy food. Someone doesn't like world music. I really like world music. We shouldn't live together. It's not going to work. It's not going to be happy. She wants an expensive house on the beach and I want to live in my van. Yeah, it's not going to work. But we can be friends and we can have a great sexual friendship as well. So, these things, I think it's important to be able to distinguish all these different things. And when we do that, I think there's a lot less disappointment and sadness and a lot fewer relationships that really shouldn't be, that shouldn't exist. I think a lot of people get married because they really like fucking each other. That's not a reason to get married. That just means you really like fucking each other. And that's great. And that's what it is. And let it be that. But just because you have a good sexual connection with someone does not mean you should live with them. Definitely not. That's a whole different set of criteria. That's like, I don't know. It's like taking a job because you really like the building that you would work in. Like, no, that's not why you would take that job. I mean, it's cool if you happen to have a job you love and it's in a building you really like being in, then that's great. But the building is not the reason you take the job, right? It's a secondary issue. So that's, I don't know. I feel like I didn't really make that distinction. I talked about the disappointment of how I misunderstood some relationships. And then when the reality came to the fore, it was disappointing, and how you sort of go through that a lot in LA with producers and, all these people who are very, their whole life revolves around the audience. It's like when there's no audience, they kind of disappear sometimes. And and again, I'm not talking about everyone, and I don't mean to be throwing shit at anyone in particular. Just, as I've moved away from LA and I look back on that, and I see that there are some people who, continue to be people, and then there are other people where it's like it's all about the audience. It's strange and sad and weird. Yeah, anyway, so I don't really know what the hell, why I'm talking about all that. The other thing I wanted to sort of discuss a little bit is this article that I read a couple weeks ago. It's an article about, I think I mentioned it on a previous podcast, the headline, it's in The Guardian. The headline is, "As March Madness rolls on, so will the myths of Black athletic superiority." And the article is by Reagan Griffin Jr. And the subheading is, "Black sports stars have collectively achieved what they have because society presents them with few other options." It's a really strange article. Because the argument that he's making is that, and he makes it in a very aggressive, sort of dismissive way, like anyone who disagrees is a fucking idiot. But the argument that he's making is that it's totally wrong to think that Black athletes dominate any given sport because of any innate physical advantages that they may have. And it's actually kind of racist to think that. Because the fact is that the reason the top athletes in several different sports are Black is that they don't have other economic opportunities. And so there's a desperation that they feel as kids to excel at these sports because it's like the only way out of poverty and oppression. And the thing that I find so sort of annoying and emblematic, or this article is such an example of something, is that the author seems incapable of understanding that two things can be true at the same time. And yet he actually says that in the article. So let me explain to you what I mean. The article begins by saying, this is the first paragraph, "Not to toot my own horn, but growing up, I was quite the athlete. When the time came to select teams for dodgeball or relay races, I was often among those picked first, myself and many of my other Black friends. In most of the schools I attended throughout my childhood, my classmates tended to be a healthy mix of all races. But at every stop, I found that Black students consistently dominated the playground." So he starts off by saying that even as kids, even kids in multiracial schools, so presumably these were not like inner city, South Bronx, everybody's disadvantaged kind of schools. So they're at least mixed racially. We don't know if they're mixed in terms of class, but they're mixed racially. But the Black kids seem to do better at sports. Black students consistently dominated the playground. Now, that doesn't mean that all the Black kids were better at all sports than all the white kids. It just means that the top performers in different sports happen to be Black, right? Then he says, it didn't take long for our young, naive minds to hypothesize. It must be in the genes, right? There were clear patterns, and the most obvious explanation for our athletic success, at least to our adolescent reasoning, was that the black kids were simply built for it. The white kids believed it. The black kids believed it. Hell, I even bought it for a while. I was young and dumb. Fortunately, I have since matured. So thinking that the black kids were faster, that all the fastest runners happen to be black, thinking that that was caused by some genetic difference between those kids and the kids who weren't as fast, it was stupid, according to Reagan Griffin Jr. And he's matured from that dumb perspective. So does he think then that the reason the black kids won the race is because everybody just believed that black kids were faster? Does believing that someone is faster actually make them run faster? Or does it make the white kids run slower? I'm not sure about that. So then he continues, unfortunately, the same can't be said of everyone. In other words, not everyone outgrew this young, dumb perspective like me. These groundless theories have transcended the schoolhouse, making their way to the mainstream. And then he talks about the NCAA basketball tournament, and he says, we're likely to hear many of the same tired old tropes referencing the inherent physicality of some of America's best black athletes. Many people ascribe to the same sort of logic that my peers and I possessed in elementary school. He said adolescent earlier, but okay, now we're in elementary school, but on a much larger scale. If black people so heavily dominate football and basketball, they must be built differently than the rest of us, right? Now, he says this is a racist thing to believe. He quotes someone saying, Entine, a writer named John Entine, who wrote a book called Taboo, Why Black Athletes Dominate Sports and Why We're Afraid to Talk About It. Quote, check the NBA statistics. Not one white player has finished among the top scorers or rebounders in recent years. White running backs, cornerbacks, or wide receivers in the NFL, you can count them on one hand. And now Lewis says, to call this flimsy logic would be an understatement. This is an egregiously, laughably, irresponsibly asinine line of thinking. While everyone is not as willing to be as openly ignorant as Entine was, we find traces of the same prejudiced ideology. And then he gives some examples. Now, the problem is that what Lewis is assuming is that to say that there may be some genetic factor that gives an advantage to some black athletes in particular sports like sprinting or jumping. In the case of basketball, running fast and being able to jump are two really important things. So to say that, there's something about the typical physiology of people who come from Western Africa that gives an advantage to those activities. To say that is not only asinine and racist and ridiculous, but it also implies, according to his line of thinking, that these people don't work as hard, that they don't practice as hard. And that's his mistake, right? His mistake is in saying, because someone is taller, they're likely, they have an advantage in basketball. That's just true, right? That's just true. And being tall is something that you have because of your DNA, because of where your ancestors came from. People from Holland are taller than people from Spain. Yes, there are tall Spaniards. Yes, there are short Dutch people. But on average, if your ancestors come from Holland, you are probably going to be taller than if your ancestors came from Spain or Italy or Morocco. That's just obvious. That doesn't mean that a basketball player who's 7 feet tall doesn't work out hard, doesn't have discipline, doesn't have great ball handling skills that may have nothing to do with their DNA, that only come from the fact that they really worked hard when they were a kid. This is the mistake. The mistake is that both things are true. And to believe that one is true is not asinine. It's obvious. Look at the top 100 sprinters in the world. If you take a list of the top 100 sprinters, I'd bet it $1,000 that 90 of them are black, at least. Does that make me a racist, or is that just obvious? I think it's obvious. It's obvious, when you look at the results. And this is like the debate that's going on now about trans women competing in women's sports. And you have people making the argument that there is no physiological difference between someone who was born in a male body, who transitions to be a woman, and someone who was born in a female body. There's no difference. We all know there's a difference. Everyone knows there's a difference. To believe otherwise is to defy the obvious. I just saw an interview yesterday with a woman arguing that testosterone offers absolutely no advantage in sports. And so even if the trans woman has higher testosterone levels, this gives her no advantage whatsoever over women who are born in female bodies. There's no difference in bone density, really. There's no difference in shoulder, in the broadness, is broadness a word, of shoulders. No difference in musculature. Are you fucking kidding me? Of course there is. We can all see it with our eyes. And yet we live in this weird time where, in order to be accepted and not canceled and not called out as a transphobe, you need to pretend you believe what you know is not true. This is like living in fucking Maoist China, where you have to pretend to believe that Mao is God, or living in North Korea, where you have to genuflect before Kim Jong-un, who is, obviously the most superior human being who's ever existed. He shoots a hole in one every time he goes to the golf course. Like, yeah, that's all bullshit. But if you don't believe it, they'll take you out and shoot you. And that's kind of like where we're going with this. It's absurd. He gets into slavery. He says some will even go so far as to attribute the dominance of black athletes to the atrocities of slavery. One of the most despicable transgressions in American history was the genetic manipulation of black bodies by white slaveholders. This is wrongly understood by many to be a major contributing factor in the athletic dominance of Americans today. Now, it's historically true that slave owners required the biggest, strongest men to have sex with some of the biggest, strongest women slaves, with an eye toward having big, strong children who they were property, right? So they were being treated as property. And it's true that this is despicable. It's true that it's horrible. But the fact that it's horrible doesn't mean that it didn't happen, and it doesn't mean that it's wrong to discuss the potential effects of this. This was essentially a breeding program that was instituted to create bigger, stronger human beings. And the fact that it was done under horrible conditions doesn't mean it wasn't done, and it doesn't mean that it's illegitimate to talk about the potential effects of that. You know, it's like in science that there's this big problem around talking about some of the research that the Nazis did, which some of the medical research by Joseph Mengele and others, it was being done in some of the most horrible conditions in human history. It was being done to unwilling people in slave camps, in extermination camps. But does that totally, does our moral repugnance at those conditions invalidate the data that were collected? What if the data that were collected would save lives if we incorporated that into pharmacological understanding, for example? Do we just cover our eyes and not look at what was learned because it was learned in such horrible conditions by such horrible people? That doesn't seem to make sense to me. But that is what's happened largely. And it's interesting that that's how a lot of the medical research has been treated that was conducted by the Nazis. But their research into rocketry, totally welcome. Hey, yeah, okay, you guys learned a lot of stuff when you were building those rockets that you were shooting at London, trying to kill people in London. You know what? The war's over. Why don't you come work for us now and help us build rockets to get to the moon, which is exactly what happened. So anyway, he says, jokes aside, this is also a ridiculous notion, talking about the idea that some of this intentional breeding could have had any effect on the size and strength of descendants of those slaves. I don't see how that's ridiculous. It seems kind of obvious, but no. Mr. Lewis Reagan Griffin contends that that is a totally ridiculous notion. He says, beyond the fact, and this is this really gets to it, right? This sentence, beyond the fact that it feels like a blatant injustice to even attempt to grasp at any sort of positive consequence from this brutal infringement upon human rights, the claim that ancestral breeding is the primary source of Black athletic superiority is unsubstantiated by both history and science. Now look at what he's doing. This is tricky here. First of all, it feels, okay, we're not talking about what you're making an argument that there is no way that some black people have any inherent physiological advantage in sports, that's a scientific discussion. That's not about what you feel. But it's clear that this entire article is inspired by feeling, and the science is being manipulated and massaged and jammed in to try to support that feeling. And this is why it's really difficult to respond to this, but why I feel compelled to, because I agree with the feeling. I share the feeling. But the feeling is different from the facts. And when we allow our feelings to dominate the facts, then we've lost touch with reality. Then we're in a situation where if you say something that makes me feel bad, you're a bad person and you need to be eliminated. That's a bad place to be. That's a really, really bad place to be. A very dangerous place to be. So let's unpack this, okay? It feels like a blatant injustice to even attempt to grasp at any sort of positive consequence from this brutal infringement upon human rights. Now, the fact that it feels horrible does not mean that it can't happen. So the fact that it feels terrible to try to see, oh, there's a slight positive thing from this horrible situation, that shouldn't determine how you view the situation, right? You're putting your cart before the horse. You're putting your feelings before the reality. No matter how strong your feelings are, you need to preserve the responsibility to try to unpack the reality and then adjust your feelings if necessary. Don't try to make reality fit into your feelings. The claim that ancestral breeding is the primary source. Now, he added that. Nobody's saying it's the primary source. And this is a typical rhetorical trick. Set up your opposition. Nobody said it was the primary source of black athletic superiority. The question is it a factor? Is it maybe a deciding factor? Because, if you have someone with a slight physiological advantage and everything else is the same, then it can be an important factor. But saying that it's the primary source makes your job easier to debunk it, right? He says it's unsubstantiated by both history and science. And then he puts out one study. He says, according to a study conducted by a zoologist at Oregon State, lasting evolutionary changes in a population require around 1 million years to occur. Even if we assume that the forced reproduction of the enslaved was rampant in America, the 400 years in which slavery existed in the United States is nowhere near enough time to produce drastic results in today's African American population. Okay, so I haven't read the study by Oregon State zoologist Joseph Ayeda, but I am pretty confident that when he says lasting evolutionary changes in a population require around 1 million years to occur, he is not talking about directed breeding programs. Because I'll tell you what, 1 million years ago, that poodle was a wolf. 10,000 years ago, that poodle was a wolf. 5,000 years ago, that poodle was a wolf. 500 years ago, that golden retriever was a wolf. So to say it requires 1 million years for lasting evolutionary change to occur in a population is nonsense. Look at the changes in chickens. Look at the changes in cattle. Look at the changes in any domesticated animal where humans have directed their reproductive activity. It's not 1 million years. Humans haven't been here for 1 million years. We've changed ourselves through all sorts of inadvertent controls on our breeding, selective breeding. It doesn't take 1 million years. It takes a few generations. That's nonsense. And anyone who can think the least bit clearly knows it's nonsense. Anyway, so, I wouldn't have even really gotten into this except at the end, he says, ultimately, we place the idea that black people are naturally more inclined for sports, okay, right alongside all the other tired stereotypes. There is no excuse for explicitly championing this notion of inherent black athletic superiority or complicitly perpetuating it by discussing black athletes as though their success is an inevitability, which, again, that's the straw man. The fact of the matter is, black athletes have collectively achieved what they have because society presented them with few other options. So he's making this economic opportunity argument, saying the only reason black people do well in sports is because they don't have other options. And then he finishes by saying, to believe anything else is foolish. It is the stuff of school children. And yet he begins this whole essay by saying, as school children, the black kids did better on the playground. So his entire essay makes no fucking sense whatsoever. And so I Googled around a little bit, and I found within 2 minutes a scientific paper written by researchers at Howard University, which, by the way, is a predominantly black university, pointing out that 28 of the last 38 world record holders in the men's 100-meter dash have been black athletes. And researchers at Howard University think they know why. Oh, it was Howard and Duke University working together. Since 1968, the world record holders in the men's 100-meter dash have all been black athletes. Now, is this because these people had no other economic opportunities? Really? What about really poor athletes from Vietnam who had no other economic opportunities? Or India? You would think there are lots and lots and lots of Indian people who have no economic opportunities who, if running the 100-meter dash in under 9 seconds or something was their ticket, their meal ticket, they'd be working on it, right? But no. I mean, these arguments just fall apart the minute you start thinking about them. Anyway, these people said, now these, again, are black researchers, I believe. They said that although there are also cultural factors at work, it all comes down to body makeup. Blacks tend to have longer limbs with smaller circumferences, meaning that their centers of gravity are higher compared to white people of the same height. Asians and whites tend to have longer torsos, so their centers of gravity are lower. These differences are small, and we really don't see them when we look at someone. We are only rarely struck by how long someone's legs are. But these small differences matter in races lasting less than 10 seconds. The height of a person's center of gravity affects how fast his feet are moving when they hit the ground. Each step a runner takes is like falling, except the athlete breaks the fall with his foot. So a person with a higher center of gravity will hit the ground faster than someone with a lower center of gravity. And then they go through and talk about these racial differences in length of torso compared to length of limbs. I mean, that's just true. And it's not racist to acknowledge it. It's not racist to acknowledge that in general, Japanese people have a different ratio of torso to leg length than people from Senegal. That's not racist. It's true. And so I feel very, when I read these things, I feel like we're going in a dangerous direction, and we need to be very careful about this. Lastly, I just want to say there is an article that was written by Malcolm Gladwell a few years ago in the New Yorker. Where is it? I downloaded it here. It's somewhere. Gladwell. Yes. It's available. I think it's available online. I subscribe to the New Yorker, so I found it in the archives. It's now Malcolm Gladwell, by the way, is half Jamaican, half British, half white. So he's mixed race, and he is a sprinter. He raced track and field in high school and college. So he's got a lot of expertise in both the racial issues and the sports issues. And this article is fantastic. It's called The Sports Taboo. And the subheading is Why Blacks Are Like Boys and Whites Are Like Girls. And essentially what he argues in this article, let me find the date for you if I can. I don't see the... New Yorker doesn't have the date. Here it is, May 19th, 1997. It says 20 years ago. What he argues in this article is that the bell curves are different for blacks and whites. The bell curves are different. So basically what he says is that for blacks, you tend to have dispersal at the top and the bottom. So some of the worst athletes are black and some of the best athletes are black. And there aren't many blacks in the middle. Whereas with whites, it's more like you have a lot of people in the middle and not many at the bottom or the top. And he compares this to boys and girls in their, I believe he's talking primarily about their sort of mathematics scores. So with the girls, you have lots of girls in the middle, lots of girls who are good at math, but not a lot who really, really suck or who are really, really good. Whereas boys, it's the opposite bell curve where you have a fair amount of boys who really suck at math, myself included, and not as many who are just sort of so-so. And then you have some super geniuses who are boys. And so when you look at mathematics, you tend to see more men. That doesn't mean men in general are better at math. It means that the very best mathematicians tend to be men. So he's saying it's a similar thing with blacks and whites in particular sports that require speed, racing. So he's saying that it's not that if you just pick a black person off the street and a white person off the street, that they're necessarily, the black person's always going to win the race. But if you're looking at who are the fastest runners, they're probably going to be black. To me, this is a nuanced argument. This is an interesting argument. It's not an argument that comes out of a need to arrive at a particular conclusion because it feels right or because it'll make your friends happy. So I encourage you to read that article if you would like to. I'm going to stop talking now. Thank you for listening. This has been Roma. Roma 46, I believe. And if you prefer your podcasts visual, you can see this on my YouTube channel, Chris Ryan. If not, you know where to find it, right where you find everything else. Thanks for listening.